Hello, this is Dylan Moore and Nima Mahdjour of IridaTV coming to you today. We are doing it live. Today is Monday. It's Monday, isn't it, Nima? Monday, June 11th, 2022, and today...
July.
Whatever.
7-11.
They supposed to start with J, and they're both four letters. I can't comprehend it further than that. That's why I get them confused. So,
okay, let's go into the history of the month names.
Are we going to start with Roman stuff? Man, I told everyone we're going to talk about financial capitalism, but sure. No, July is Julius Caesar. But what's June? I don't remember June.
Yeah, I don't know either. Juno? Is she some goddess or something?
Probably Juno. No.
And then August, right? August was Augustus.
That's right. So there used to be 10 months in the Roman calendar and 355 days, and the years used to get off so much that the consul or the Senate had to reorient the calendar, and then Julius Caesar actually instituted the modern calendar that we still use, the Julian calendar. That he I guess he didn't introduce the 2 new months yet, but he did introduce the 365 and a quarter days with the leap year. So, we're going to be talking about some evolution of civilization style stuff today. So I guess that is a good starting point. Is that you never know what holdovers that you have from the previous civilization, and we still have the calendar from our we should call it the father of Western civilization, classical civilization. So that is an interesting point to start us off on. But what we wanted to talk about was Western civilization, and in particular, Western civilization right now, because I don't know if you've noticed, Nima, now that he's, I don't know, messing with his blinds or something. I don't know if you've noticed, but Western civilization is in somewhat of a pickle at the moment. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, in the conflict stage.
We're in what you could describe the conflict stage if we go by Carroll Quigley's 7 stages of civilization, which is something to the effect of the method, I'm going to use that term, by which the people of a civilization prosper ceases to function the way it's supposed to function, and the civilization deals with it typically by going to war, which I'm sure nobody makes any sort of corollary from what I just said there with our modern civilization in the West. But the civilization makes up for it by going to war and capturing booty and getting rid of excess, I guess, literally getting rid of excess people, but also giving the jobless people at home not being able to participate in the systems that used to work a thing to do, which is go out and kill people and acquire more booty. And the system kind of perpetuates itself a little longer through that. And Western civilization, interestingly enough, has gone through these phases. Again, if we're going by the Carroll Quigley method, which, if you're unfamiliar with Carroll Quigley, maybe we should mention that. Carroll Quigley wrote the book Tragedy and Hope, which is kind of the conspiracy theorist starting point, if we want to call it that. And it's a great book, fascinating read, and I think there's more to it than just jumping up and down saying, hey, here's the global conspiracy. There's a lot of very valuable historical information in there. But he wrote another book, which I find even more valuable, which is The Evolution of Civilizations, which Quigley posits a scientific method by which history can be interpreted. Which I think, I'm not here to say that because I think it's valid, but I do think it's valid. I think he makes a very good point, and not so much because his point's better than others, but more because there doesn't really seem to be anybody else making a point of saying, here's how we apply scientific analysis to history. It's just everybody collecting data. And he makes fun of this, that, okay, how are you supposed to understand anything if you just endlessly collect data and you never try to compare what's going on with that data? So every civilization...
So you collect data, but you don't have the context for the data, right?
Exactly.
You just list it in chronological order. And that's how most of us were taught history in high school and even in college, I would say. It's just
and it's boring.
Memorizing dates.
It's horribly boring. And Quigley points this out at the beginning of the book too, that there's an infinite number of facts Like, if we want to go digging for facts, we will never find them all, ever. And part of the job of the historian is to determine which facts are important and at what point do we stop getting facts and we start using analysis. And one of the, or I should say, the key point that he brings up in his analysis when looking at the way civilizations work is that every human institution, every societal institution, which is created with a certain goal, will eventually reorient itself where it's no longer accomplishing the goal that it was created to accomplish. For example, an army is supposed to accomplish defending the nation. And instead, it turns into a beast that is there to feed. Its primary goal is to feed itself. Now, often this can turn into the organization accomplishing the opposite of what it was originally intended to do. Say the army turns around and conquers the nation and installs a military dictatorship or something, right? That was the opposite of the intent of the original intention of the army. But regardless of what it actually ends up doing, the function that goes on in the middle is that the people working inside the institution, because it's made up of individuals, are naturally going to look out for themselves. They want to get better promotions. They want to make more money. They want to have more status and titles or whatever inside the institution. So they're going to make individual decisions for that to be the case. Simultaneously, and typically, it's nobody's job within the institution to make sure that the goal is gone after, right? It's nobody's specific job in the army to make sure that the army is defending the nation. It's not the soldier's job. It's not the cook's job. It's not transport's job. It's not the Navy's job. Everybody has their job, and no one, and not. I mean, maybe there are organizations that do this, but nobody's sitting back going, okay, what's the purpose of this organization anyway, and are we accomplishing that purpose?
Right, and it seems like almost a much bigger effort is spent on talking about how defending the nation is the purpose of the military,
right?
Instead of doing this thing,
right? Well, and then the big thing is the third point is that eventually you end up with vested interests inside the institution that like the setup because they personally benefit from it, and they become the resistive effort within inside that institution that says, no, I like the way it is, I don't want to change it. I mean, I guess if we take, sticking with the army, if you've got people who are, say, the soldiers are more interested in getting their pay. The officers are more interested in making sure that, they get funding for whatever they're doing, or that they get sent here or that they get sent there. And then the ammunition companies are more interested in making sure that the bullets come in. And then, we got to impress Congress and make sure that they keep the financing coming, the funding coming. And it's all about these individual people looking out for themselves. And they say, okay, now that we've gotten this financing coming, we've married the military industrial complex to each other. If we knock anything out of order, the people really benefiting from that aren't going to benefit from it anymore. So they're going to really make sure that the army does what it needs to do to make sure that continues to benefit. Maybe that is going to war with a country that doesn't really need to be gone to war with. Cough Iraq, cough Afghanistan, cough Libya, cough every other country in the Middle East. Cough Ukraine.
Yeah, George W. Bush recently reminded us of how evil it is for one man to just decide to invade Iraq on a whim.
Right. He would know. He would know. I mean, he would really know. Anyway, so a civilization, again, if we define it per Quigley's definition, which I think is a great definition, a civilization has a unique instrument of expansion. So this is a societal organization that creates surplus. We're gonna get all economic-y on you here. It creates surplus, it saves surplus, and it reinvests that surplus where the general population gets to benefit from it. And if we want to look at this kind of in an ancient, easier to understand model, imagine ancient Sumeria, where the priesthood is the instrument of expansion. They acquire the surplus of the farmers because people are coming to them, bringing offerings and sacrifices and paying taxes. And then let's say they take that and they reinvest it into irrigation. They reinvest it into roads. They reinvest it into infrastructure. Everybody gets to benefit from that. Now,
well, and they reinvest it because they have accumulated stuff that other people need.
Right.
And don't have
probably food back in that day, right? Enough access to food to say, okay, we can feed people for 3 years to build this irrigation canal or whatever.
Or access to money or whatever medium is needed to make resources move in your direction, basically.
Correct. So now if we fast forward to what Quigley calls the institutionalization of that instrument, where the factors that we just described start coming into play, what if the priesthood, after acquiring that surplus, saving that surplus, they say, you know what, let's build ziggurats and hanging gardens and have 40 sex slaves and 40 other servants and have outstanding lavish parties and make sure that we have all these different differentiating status symbols, and we're going to dress up to show it, and all these resources get poured on non-productive elements of society. Well, who suffers? Well, the people who are typically supposed to receive the benefit of that, right? So the people who are still paying the taxes, that they're still doing the effort to create that surplus, they're still giving it over to the organization which is saving it, are no longer receiving the benefit. Now, typically, nobody knows what's going on. You get unrest, and the way that the state usually responds to it, as we said, is to send everybody to war, because that'll pay for everything and give something for these people to do. That is the ancient way of looking at it. So if we fast forward and we look at the West, me and Nima have a lot of private conversations trying to tackle this question, because Carroll Quigley, and we're going to discuss these points, talks about the various phases that the West has gone through. I mentioned that the West has gone through several iterations. We're going to talk about those iterations soon. But when Carroll Quigley wrote his books, it was at the beginning of what he considered to be a new iteration, and then he promptly died. Not writing any more books to tell us what's going on, Nima. What are we going to do without Carroll Quigley telling us? Telling us what's going on. So me and Nima talk about, well, what is going on now? Because if we can identify what the instrument should be, or what the instrument was originally, what the institutionalization has become, now we can start having a more interesting conversation of what do we do about it? Or what do we see being done about it, and where can we focus energy, and where can we, I guess, focus good attitude and avoiding black pills, which I'm always a big fan of doing. So I think it is prudent to begin with the beginnings of Western civilization, because finances have gotten so complicated in the modern day that there's so many things flying around. It's really hard to see what's going on. So let's go back to the dawn of Western civilization. So if we what are you pulling up here? Nima's
well,
pulling
these
up
are just some notes. These are some notes that I made on the different stages of capitalism according to Quigley. And I've also kind of juxtaposed it with Minsky, but that's later down there. So I was trying to sort of see what the overlaps are between the two thinkers.
That is great. So Western civilization, again, if we go by the definition of Carroll Quigley, what we're saying, okay, it's all about what is the instrument of expansion. The instrument of expansion of classical civilization, which is we're talking about Greece and Rome, was slavery, where the farmer, the citizen farmer, had slaves tending to his lands, where the surplus would accumulate to him, and he would be responsible for reinvesting that surplus. And because he was on the land himself, he knew what best served him. We fast forward, and I think once we start getting post-Punic War era, all the citizen farmers go off to war. The rich people at home buy up all the farms. The people come home, find out that they're jobless, and they end up in the big cities. And you start seeing these massive latifundia, which are these huge farms that are worked by slave gangs, typically not just people that aren't Roman. These are like people from the furthest reaches of the empire that got conquered as slaves, being sent back to Rome, or the Italian peninsula, or as it kept growing, to work these farms, and because the owner is now no longer on the site, he's not seeing what's going on, and he's not managing. And the manager, the cracker, the guy cranking the whip probably, is more interested in stability than he is in, getting the biggest bang for his buck. What do I mean by that? Is to say, if they have a great year, then he knows that the owner is going to expect that next year. And if they have a horrible year, he's going to get punishment for it. So if he can aim to say, okay, in really great years, I'm actually going to dial it back a little bit, so I'm not expected to perform as great as I could have the next year. And if it's bad the next year, I don't look as bad. So basically, the instrument of expansion was supposed to be creating a surplus from these farms, but the latifundia are crippling the ability to do that. And whether it's latifundia or whether it's local citizen farmers, the whole thing is dependent on slavery. You need slaves to work the farms. So that is the classical instrument of expansion. The whole thing implodes, and then whatever the kind of official date is that the Roman Empire finally dies in 463 AD or whatever the heck it is, right? We'll say roughly the 5th century. The Roman Empire dies, and then from that spawns the Western civilization, and according to Carroll Quigley, a new civilization is typically found on the periphery of an old civilization. And where was the periphery of the Roman Empire? Well, it was Northern Europe, it was Eastern Europe, and it was the Middle East. Well, what civilizations do we see from that? We see Western civilization, Orthodox civilization, and Islamic civilization. We can say the three children of the Roman, or I should say, not just Roman Empire, but classical civilization as a whole. So there's a mixture between what's left of Roman civilization or classical civilization and the Germanic tribes of the north, and these start to mix, and we add some, sprinkle some Christianity in there, which is a new religion. We get a new social organization, we get a new economic organization, we get a new political organization, we get a new military organization, we get a whole new thing, and we get the birth of Western civilization. So, Nima, you usually remember these details better than I. What is the first instrument of expansion that we see arising at the birth of Western civilization?
So obviously, in the Quigley terminology, the instrument of expansion appears at some point during the course of the development of evolution of a civilization. And in the case of Western civilization, I guess that he suggested that appeared around 970 AD in the form of the feudal manorial system, which was basically a military based expansion system. So once again, expansion or instrument of expansion in Quigley terminology, every civilization, actually a civilization is defined by...
This is a defining factor, yes.
Yeah. A producing society with an instrument of expansion. So a producing society would be some society that produces things that, basically agriculture.
As opposed to a hunter-gatherer society, which is a parasitic society. It only takes.
Hunter-gatherer is like basically standstill, right? You're always on the same level. You're always starving, on the brink of starvation. You always have to look for food, look for meat and obviously vegetables by moving around all year long.
Yep.
So then at one point they started becoming more stationary, I guess, and farming land. And at some point they were able to allocate resources towards building things that allow you to produce more in the long run, So, but in order to do that, so that is an instrument of expansion. It's the ability to save up.
We produce the excess, then save it.
Produce the excess that is then invested in things that you've invented. So it's three things, right? There's savings, there's the act of investing, and there's obviously the idea that you're investing in. So you need all these three things. You need savings, you need the desire to take risk and invest, and you need the intellectual capability, I guess, to
choose the right thing to invest into.
right, to invent new things, to invest into their development.
Do you want to switch the screen back while you're talking?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be going through these. Maybe it's going to be easier if I.
Whichever.
So the first stage of expansion Quigley suggests around 1970 through 1270. Obviously, these stages also they're going to be overlapping, so it's not a hard and fast rule.
Well, and then before you get into the next stage, because you mentioned the manorial system, I want to be clear what that means, right? Mm-hmm. Because one of the features of the collapse of the Roman Empire is that security became a huge issue. Because the Roman Empire lost control of being able to defend against, raiding Goths and Huns and everyone else. So, and also because the economics was breaking down. I mean, for example, I know most of the grain came from North Africa. If there's an issue in North Africa, suddenly your grain supply gets shut off. Well, you can't survive at a town unless there's people, merchants constantly bringing food into it. So people scatter from the town and they attempt to get themselves close to the food producing earth. Well, security then becomes an issue. So you attach yourself to the person who can defend you, right? This is the basis of the knight and the serfs. Is you have a military strongman with people who could defend you, the serf, and then at the time the most effective weapon was the knight on horseback, which required a serious amount of support. And what I mean by that, because horses competed directly for food with humans, Quigley estimates that it's something like 50 to 100 people. It takes 50 to 100 people producing food to support one mounted knight on horseback, right? So this is the foundation for the manorial system. And now, if you mix the mounted knight on horseback with the castle, the castles were such a superior defensive weapon at the time that the knight on horseback, for the most part, couldn't defeat the castle. They just didn't have the resources to go under siege long enough in order to get somebody to submit. So centralized government dissolved. It was just gone. So the manors become self-sufficient. They're producing everything that they need. And so the surplus gets created by the serfs. It gets saved by the knights, and then the knights are the people who get to reinvest. As Nima pointed out, this is basically a militaristic instrument of expansion that the fighting men get to accumulate the surplus, and they're the ones that get to spend it out. And I think it's also worth commenting here that the Christian manors at some point, not the manors, that the Christian abbeys at some point also accumulate surplus and get to spend it out in a similar fashion. But, I mean, that's totally in line with feudalism. So, and originally, Quigley also points this out, is that trade between manors begins with luxury goods, not what's the word I want? Commodities? Not
staples, I guess.
Yeah, they're not trading stuff that they're producing. That they're all producing. They're trading stuff that is a luxury good. So that's the foundation of the instrument of expansion in the first phase of Western civilization, and then you were about to get into what happens just right after that.
So the next stage. So this is still the feudal system. So it's not yet capitalism, but then we see the first form of capitalism emerge. So should we go back into the Quigley conflict stuff?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea because, why aren't we still in feudalism if it works so well? Right.
So every instrument within society becomes institutionalized, as Dylan just explained earlier, and that applies to organizations, military instruments, schools, business, everything.
Everything. Think of your job and think of the description that I gave at the beginning of this call. Right.
And that also applies to the instrument of expansion, whichever it may be. In the feudal manorial system, it happened to be the feudal manor, or rather the system of using military power to dominate serfs and make them produce things, and in turn you give them protection. So it's kind of a implicit trade. And that system over time, as Dylan pointed out, became institutionalized.
I think the main way, if I remember correctly, that it becomes institutionalized is once pikemen are invented. The pikemen can stand up to the mounted knight on horseback, and they're a lot cheaper, meaning you can hire them, meaning you now have mercenaries. And now that because the fighting force is no longer the chivalrous knight, it's, well, I shouldn't use that term because Quigley associates chivalry with the institutionalization of feudalism. Yeah. But, oh, look at our IridaTV chat's going off. I hope it's not someone saying he can't hear us.
No, he says great stream. That's Eric.
Okay, great. Perfect. So, lost my train of thought. No, I got it. So anyway, the knights suddenly become less and less useful because these pikemen are so cheap that now mercenary armies are what's going out, dominating or losing battles. So, and on top of that, here's the other important point. I believe this is where we start seeing the imposition of the guild system. So in the first aspect of the instrument of expansion, they figured out that, and this is kind of a prototype form of capitalism, and we're defining capitalism as pursuit of profit within a price structure. Right, I know there's a million different ways we can define capitalism. We're defining it this way for the sake of this conversation. We're now pursuing profit within a price structure.
Individual pursuit of profit.
Yes, thank you. And at the beginning, they figure out, okay, we can make more money as we trade more goods. However, as you start trading more goods and everybody's competing, prices start to fall and things get cheaper. And then people in power realize, oh, hey, we can make more money if we prevent the flow of goods. So we have guilds, and the guilds say, okay, well, we're trying to control quality, right? We're just making sure everything's doing everything right. We're controlling how much is getting made, and we get to control who has a job, and we can control where everybody works, and we slowly restrict that, but we're just making sure there's quality. So now we get the institutionalization of the instrument of what was supposed to the purpose of the instrument was to increase trade is now restricting that trade. And then we end up with the age of conflict. And I actually read a book on so it was a biography on Machiavelli not that long ago. And that guy Machiavelli ended up being a lot less interesting than I thought he was. He seemed to be kind of a dork that happened to write an interesting book once. But I was much more interested in the book because it really put a face on the internal politics of what was going on in Italy at that time. And it was just constant warfare. Just non-stop, constant warfare. And it was all about who could raise the money to hire the mercenaries. And because they were mercenaries, if Florence is fighting Pisa, and they hire these mercenaries, and Pisa turns around and says, hey, we'll offer you more, the mercenaries would turn around and start fighting Florence, right? And then there was always this specter of okay, the King of France can come in and mess up. Just constant fighting. And I think it was...
France, Milan, Florence, the Papal States, they were all sort of their own... battle. They had their own armies, their own entities. Yeah.
Well, and they didn't have their own armies. That was the problem. They had their own money, and then they had to hire the armies, right? So it was a very, very detailed, clear analysis of this age of conflict, where you get this age of universal warfare because the system has broken down. And people who are accustomed to receiving benefit from the instrument of expansion are no longer receiving it, and the only thing they could think of is to go to war to make up for the fact. So typically, what we see in an age of conflict is it ends in what's Quigley calls an age of universal empire, which we haven't reached in our civilization yet. But I think that a great and clear example is classical civilization again, which is that the Roman Empire ended up conquering the entire civilization. Because what happens is, as the instrument breaks down and this conflict starts to occur, typically on the periphery of the civilization, because they have institutionalized slower than the core, they come in, and because they're more organized and typically they have better resources and they're, in quotes, more vigorous, they come through and they conquer everything. So there was an attempt at that, and I'll be damned if I could remember the king. I think it was an English king that made that first attempt in Western civilization. Do you remember the name? Do you have Quigley pulled up? Do you have that in your notes? I'm not confused. It wasn't Charlemagne, was it?
Well, Charlemagne was a German king.
Okay, that's. I was gonna feel stupid if I said that.
But he was definitely. I mean, his empire was definitely pretty large and pretty significant at some point. But what Quigley is saying is that
you keep talking. I'm getting the book. It's driving me nuts.
Yeah, what Quigley is saying is that the first conflict began in 1270, and yeah, it was basically England trying to take control of the feudal manorial system within Western civilization. And now, just taking a step back to the concept of instrument of expansion. Every civilization has an instrument of expansion. It becomes an institution at some point, and as Dylan just said, after it becomes an institution, it would usually turn into a universal empire, after which there's no turning back from civilization collapse. So we would then have universal empire, decay, and then finally invasion. However, what can also happen is that the instrument of expansion gets reformed or circumvented. In other words, the civilization develops a new instrument of expansion, in which case the expansion phase can resume again. And this has happened in Western civilization, according to Quigley, I believe 3 times. So we're now in the fourth stage of expansion. So that's just a larger context of what I'm going through here now. So we started with the feudal manorial system from 970 through 1270. Then from 1270 through 1440 is a conflict that followed the feudal system. And England attempts to control Western civilization within that time period. But then England fails to take over the system. In other words, the universal empire doesn't materialize. Instead, the instrument of expansion, namely feudal manorial system, gets replaced by what Quigley calls commercial capitalism. Commercial capitalism emerged because, as Dylan said, these feudal lords, they like to trade in luxury goods. And then you had,
I'm back, by the way.
Yeah, I see. You had individuals and kingdoms, whatever charter, these colonial ventures that went abroad, traveled the seas and found all kinds of really fascinating goods that were really popular among these feudal lords, because on their own, they didn't really have a whole lot of impressive stuff to show off to each other. So I guess, this commercial, putting in place and cultivating these commercial trade routes became in and of itself a tool to accumulate power, to accumulate resource, to accumulate status, and with that, of course, to accumulate money, so that then a new tool of savings was invented, basically. And an instrument of expansion always requires an instrument of savings, an instrument of invention, and instrument of investment. Or rather, just saving, invention, and investment.
Side note here, while you're talking, I didn't find who was the attempted conqueror for Western civilization on the first round, but Carroll Quigley puts the date roughly at 1420. So whoever the big dude was in 1420 in Western civilization conquering everything, that was the guy who attempted the universal empire.
Well, who was the king of England in 1420?
I bet you're going to look it up.
Henry V, right?
Maybe it wasn't England. I don't know. Whatever the case.
Well, no, it was England because, and I also took notes of this. Quigley suggests that between 1270 and 1440 is when England attempted to take control of become the universal empire of Western civilization. Right.
Well, and so you were bringing up the fact that a new instrument of expansion gets born, and I think this is very interesting because first of all, as far as we know, and in modern history, countries like Japan, China, and India might now be exceptions to this rule as well, but overlooking them for the moment, Western civilization is the only civilization that's actually successfully gone through this. Whereas to say, okay, we're about to enter universal empire, which means we're now on the road to decay and on the road to collapse, but a new thing comes around which essentially acts as a rebirth to the entire civilization. We're the only ones that have done it, and we've done it 3 times. And like Nima said, we're on our 4th iteration right now. And so the commercial capitalism comes along where essentially, I think this is the most complicated of the 3 iterations because of you've got the conflict from round 1 happening while you've got the instrument of expansion from round 2 happening at the same time. But
that's oftentimes the case, right? You have overlaps,
right?
Usually,
but I think the way finances are set up in commercial capitalism, again, we see the rebirth of a money economy. Gold and silver come back into play, like we've talked about before. In terms of like debt the first 5,000 years. What's not known to most people is that from between about 600 AD to about 1200, 1400 AD or so, gold and silver aren't really used that much for money. They all end up in religious institutions. But I think the easiest way to say it is we get an updated financial system, and sea travel becomes much more effective because it used to be you didn't go into the Atlantic Ocean. You stuck to the Mediterranean. Well, now that goods can be traded by boat, you can literally circumnavigate what's going on. You can circumvent what's going on. So here comes the Henry V, we think, coming along and conquering everything. Well, okay, you can conquer that old world of swords. We're inventing the world of muskets. Have fun.
Exactly.
Right? Okay, yeah, you won. Great, but we are now, way more advanced than we were before. And so we're... It doesn't matter that you attempted the Universal Empire. And I think this will become more clear when we talk about the Universal Empire of round 2. So we talked about commercial capitalism. And once again, commercial capitalism figures out you make more money by creating more goods. And at some point, you're facilitating so many goods, things get so cheap, and then people sit around and they go, we can make more money by restricting the flow of goods.
Yeah, always a symptom of institutionalization is always restriction, right?
And I believe he calls the restriction here mercantilism.
Yes,
if I remember that correctly.
So this system petrifies, what he means by that is institutionalizes into mercantilism, which is basically now you have, instead of just riding on boats and trading things, you start attacking people who are trading competitive goods, so that there's fewer goods to go around, and so that you solidify your monopoly position or some sort of oligopolistic position within the marketplace.
Yes, and then the second round actually culminates. Obviously, we get another round of universal warfare, but it culminates in Napoleon conquering the European continent and Western civilization, and for all intents and purposes, he was winning. However, he was championing the old system. And I think Quigley even fundamentally points this out that it was fundamentally a difference in farming, because the French system was based on like a 2-tiered system, or a 2-year rotation system where you farm it 1 year and then the second year you let it grow fallow when you go back and forth. And in England, they come up with a new farming system, which is a three-year system where 1 year you farm, the second year you plant leguminous crops like clover, which reintroduces nitrogen to the soil, and the third year you have animals on the farm or on that field, which obviously further replenishes the soil. And also now, instead of trying to keep animals out, you're trying to keep animals in. Because you're keeping animals in, you can control their breeding, and you can make animals that have a lot more meat on them. So you get the agricultural revolution that's starting in England, which gives you the labor supply that you need for the next steps of the Industrial Revolution. So what's happening?
The agri-revolution preceded the Industrial Revolution. Correct?
Exactly. So while Napoleon's out conquering and winning the War of Muskets, England's in the process of inventing machine guns, metaphorically speaking. Somewhat literally, but I know machine guns are a little later, right?
Oh, yeah, way later.
And so he wins, but he was winning. I mean, Napoleon was fucking everything, and he just couldn't stand up to England, which had invented the new instrument of expansion, which is industrial capitalism.
Yeah,
mass goods.
So basically, we have the second age of conflict from 1690 through 1815, as you said. Like, it sort of culminates in Napoleon. It's an interesting period, actually, also because it was the time of the American and the French revolutions. So it was a time where the revolutionary faith was born, where today's political system, the parameters of today's political system were established, and we still use those terminologies such as left and right. And actually, according to the French revolutionaries, the more left you were, the more virtuous you were, and the more right you were, the more evil you were.
Well, that sounds corollary to today.
Well, yeah, you still have the sentiment promoted today. But so going back to, so we have the second age of conflict of Western civilization from 1690 through 1815. So that's quite a while. I don't know if the 30-year Wars is involved. I think that was a little earlier, I guess. But, definitely just a time of conflict, warfare all across Europe, etc. And France attempting to take control of this commercial capitalist system, which, as we just pointed out, is a profit through exchange of goods on an international level, mostly because you find really exotic and interesting things that feudal lords are interested in, far and abroad, where you find things that your people aren't used to, sort of novelty items.
And then I could be very clear here what he says, because I found the page in the book, or the pages in the book. I'm not going to sit here and read them all because it's a lot. But he said that there was 5 key points. So he says, in these wars Napoleon was fighting the wave of the future with the methods of the past. This can be seen quite clearly if we merely look at 4 or 5 aspects of the new 19th century of expansion. And so the first one he talks about is financial. And most important, I guess the most important thing that you won't know from listening to the typical alternative news, we'll put it that way, is that most of Western civilization suffered from a lack of money. Even during the Spanish conquests of the Americas, bringing back tons of gold and silver, they didn't have enough specie to fund the growth. Now, leading up to Napoleon, we get the Bank of England. Now, I'm not giving a moral adjudication of whether the Bank of England was good or whether it was bad. However, by creating a system where they could create money as they needed it, they were able to utilize resources in a better way, as opposed to waiting around for gold or silver to be shipped from the continent, or I mean the New World.
Yeah, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Bank of England was created sometime around 690, and I just thought it was interesting because we have here the second expansion, commercial capitalism culminates in 1690. So it seems like the Bank of England was pretty instrumental in bringing about the next stage, which, as you said, is industrial capitalism. So now...
Hold on. Before you say that, I just wanted to say what these other points were of the old system, why this old system was going to lose against the new system. He mentions the agricultural system, which I already described. Then there was a third important element in the situation. This was the shift from craft system of manufacture to an industrial system. I think that sentence alone describes it. There is a fourth way in which the Napoleonic Wars represented a struggle between the new and the old. I am going to read this part because this is a little more philosophical. On the Napoleonic side, we find ranged all forces of mercantilism, meaning the theories and the vested interest forces that believed economic life had to be regulated by the government and regulated for largely political ends. This system played a very significant role in Western civilization in the period from 1200 to 1800, but by the latter date it was clearly obsolete and had to be replaced by a more advanced system. This newer system of economic management is known as laissez-faire and is well known as it was associated with the period of expansion of the 19th century. What is not so well known is what the shift from one to the other actually entailed. And then I don't, if I keep reading, if I keep reading, I'll start reading multiple pages. But I wanted to point that out because Quigley also points out somewhere else in the book that Napoleon really felt like he was fighting in a world where there was a limited pie, that it wasn't enough to feed everybody, and he was there fighting for his portion of the pie, as opposed to what was happening in England where they're going, we'll just make more pie. Right? And then everybody can eat, and then we'll kick your ass because we've entered a new realm of society.
A new dimension almost.
Yeah.
A new dimension of growth. But yeah, so once again, that's the mindset of an institutionalized organization. It's, this is what we have and we need to grab as much as we possibly can from it versus let's just make more. And
right. And commit our resources to figure out how we can continue making more to make everybody more or more wealthy.
Right. And that's just something that when you're in an institutionalized organization, there's no reason to think about those things, right? For you, there's no real incentive for you as a profit-seeking individual to think about those things. But it has to come from the outside. It has to come from
at least in the short term, right? I mean,
well,
because right now we've been speaking very amorally, right? Let's add a drop of morality in here, which is to say that, okay, maybe I could benefit from this because by just being a part of the institution, but at some point, I mean, some people make it off and steal from everybody their whole lives and they make off just fine, but sometimes history catches up with you and the whole fucking system collapses around you and you lose everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not just sometimes, right? That basically that's always going to happen at some point.
Well, I'm saying you could get lucky and it doesn't happen within your lifetime.
Right. You could get lucky and it turns the universal empire and you dominate everything and everyone.
Right.
But then
But at some point you get invaded and you collapse.
Right. And pretty quickly too, right? So those phases don't really take that long anymore, generally speaking. The decay and the invasion, the universal empire may last for a while. Obviously, lots of factors involved there. But yeah, so we went from feudal. We went from rewarding strength and military and weaponry skills, and just crushing skulls and beating people up and killing people. That's what was rewarded under feudalism. That's what people saw, the security that was inherent with what the people could supply who had those skills, and they could protect the serfs, etc. We went from that to rewarding luxury goods, obtaining more fancy, shiny baubles from abroad, etc., trading them internationally, making a profit by selling selling high, buying low. Obviously, there's we've all heard these stories of Americans or colonialists going somewhere and I don't know, selling the natives really unimpressive things like nails, or giving them nails and then getting gold in exchange because the natives didn't know what to do with gold.
Right, if they weren't just enslaved in the first place and forced into the mines. Right.
So then we get to from feudal to commercial. Now we get to industrial capitalism. What gets rewarded in industrial capitalism? It's inventiveness. It's building new things out of the things that we have available, mechanics in other words, and also, of course, the utilization of chemical energy.
I think that's the big one.
The steam engine. So basically replacing animal energy with chemical energy.
Which is, I mean, if you compare the three different types of energy that we've roughly worked with. I guess there's technically four, but I'll get to that in a second. We start off with human power, right, which is mostly slavery, like what your muscles can do. Then there's animal power, which is, okay, I can put the yoke on my ox and pull this plow. Then there's chemical power. Well, the difference between human and animal power is it's significant, but it's, what is it, how much stronger is an ox than you? What, 10 times? I don't know. Well, how much stronger is an engine than an ox? How much more potency can we put in a quart of gasoline than we can in the stomach of an ox? And I think, one of the best ways to think about that is, we all have cars. We just fill up with this magical liquid called gas or diesel, and they take us around at 60 miles an hour wherever we want to go. Like, that is completely unheard of in the rest of human history, that people would be so wealthy to be able to do that, and it's all based on chemical power. And just as a side note, I guess the fourth might be nuclear power, because
so now we've gone from linear increase in power to basically exponential.
Yeah.
Right. So industrial capitalism, basically the ability to manufacture things out of raw materials and resources and labor that's available to you locally, became the capitalist system that allowed Western civilization to circumvent the institutionalization of commercial capitalism. And it basically allowed Western civilization to make the Napoleonic aspirations of dominating the system of commercial capitalism completely obsolete. And that was, of course, the rise of England as a global power, or rather England, and then later on Great Britain, and then of course the United Kingdom. And this system, which went from, according to Quigley, approximately 1770 through 1850, this industrial capitalist system was characterized by owner management. So the factory owners were in charge of directing the course of, or the future of the business itself. And it was also marked by self-funding. So basically the profits, the main source of funding for industry expansion was industry's own profitability. But these large industry concerns required a lot of economic energy, so a lot of money basically, to put together these giant factories, giant corporations, or at that point I would say slowly growing corporate entities. And so that's how the practice of stock market financing and investment banking became more relevant. In other words, industrialists would seek out organizations that had the ability to get people to commit large sums of money, or rather pool individual smaller funds of money into one large source of money. And that money would then allow the industrialists to expand much more so than they were previously able to do. And what came with this was obviously the phenomenon of the common stock, which is a piece of paper that gives the owner certain rights, certain ownership shares, certain voting shares, etc. But definitely access to a portion of the profits of the organization. And now, of course, that this kind of paper is valued on a marketplace where people assess the organization's ability to have future profitability and the kind of business risk that's involved with operating in that business, in that industry, and of course in the overall market economy as a whole. So you have business, industry, and market. Business, industry, and macroeconomic factors all determining how much this stock is worth. So you had banks, investment banks, traders, etc., starting to make profit on buying and selling these paper instruments, these
securities,
stocks, and also
basically.
securities, and these bonds. And so we started seeing a new phase of capitalism, which Quigley refers to as financial capitalism, starting in 1850 through 1932, where the profit or the savings accumulation occurs when these banks buy low and sell high, or funds, banks, whatever you want to, whichever entities profit from buying and selling stocks. And obviously, how do you make money in this environment? How do you make money by buying stocks low and by selling high? Well, you make money by crunching data and by coming up with predictions on where's the profitability of this business going in the future. What's going to happen in the future that current investors are not thinking about, that I think I know better than them. And if I end up being right, then I get rewarded for that. So in my opinion, this is almost like the first stage of what you could call data capitalism, I guess. But, nobody's named it that. I'm just saying the critical factor in financial capitalism is really data, whereas previously in feudal manorial system, it's strength. In commercial capitalism, it's having these trade routes. In industrial capitalism, it's inventiveness, putting things together, energy, harnessing the energy. And in financial capitalism, it's your ability to predict future outcomes by being better than everyone else who's trying to predict future outcomes.
Well, and then let's make sure we get every piece of financial capitalism, because there's the aspect which you've brought up for sure. But there's also the aspect where, these industrial capitalists, or industrial capitalists, that's a fine term. They need to raise money to be able to afford the things they want to do. I want to build a big factory. I can't raise it on my own, so we issue common stock. At some point, the common stock, issuing common stock can't raise enough money to do what they want to do, so they have to turn to financial institutions to get loans for that money, which puts which shifts power into the bankers, right? Where you start seeing investment bankers starting to appear on all the boards of directors because they have a share in what's going on. Now, eventually, we see. So
just to be clear, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's kind of a little bit the other way around, because you did have commercial banks before that who would make loans. But these loans were rather short-term loans, and they were made based on...
Oh, there was a third step. I think I know where you're going with this.
The loans were based on the circulating capital that's already available, that you have that you can offer up as collateral within your business. And, it would be used to fund short-term shortfalls of money over a couple of months or so. But then these growing industry concerns required really long-term financing of large industry concerns, large industry factories, facilities, and that necessitated this whole concept of investment banking, which was about pooling individual savings into one large sum and then allowing the business to spend that money and then allocating profitability shares based on who bought how many shares.
Right. Well, and then there's a stage after that, which is monopoly capitalism.
Yeah.
Which is where and we're still in the third phase of Western civilization here, which is where the companies get so big and they've made so much money they can just finance themselves. We want to build a new factory, yeah, we can afford that. Go.
Well, yeah, right, because these investment banks were utilized in order to fund very large projects that come with a lot of hurdles of getting into competing with these businesses and whatever. And so these very large projects, these very large facilities, factories, etc., made the capitalists, the owners, the business owners, very profitable, right? And they got to a point where they didn't need the investment banks as much anymore. but they were rather once again able to fund themselves, and also you had the formation of cartels, trade associations.
Well, I was just about to get into that. Thank you for bringing that up, because once again we see the same damn pattern of, at first, industrial capitalism. We make money by selling as many goods as possible, by increasing the flow of trade. Well, monopoly capitalism, now that we have control over ourselves, I think we make more money if we restrict the flow of trade. God, it's like we heard this before or something.
Exactly.
So this culminates into, at first, 1929, the stock market crash. Quigley aims at directly as the point that this system fails. And
well, what culminates? The financial capitalism?
No, the instrument of expansion, or I should say, excuse me, the age of expansion stops in 1929 because of the crash.
Oh. Because we have another conflict,
Right.
Well, yeah,
and then we go into, I mean, and of course, these overlap. The conflict had already started years before, but I mean, there's the clear end of expansion on 1929, and then Hitler represents the third attempt at universal empire, right, where he gets control over most of Europe. And then that ends the way that we know that it ends, and we have a wonderful fairy tale about how that ended, perpetuated forever and ever, that we don't have time to go into right now. But needless to say, Hitler lost, Germany lost, and we've created a system where I'm trying to find, here it is, that we're now left to our own devices, which is what me and Nima started the show an hour ago to talk about, right? And he started getting into with the data capitalism, right? Is that when I'm looking at the book now, Quigley puts the new potential instrument of expansion, because he's writing the book in the 60s going, hey, this is too new, I don't know what's going on from a historical perspective. He says, okay, in 1945, we get the New Deal, and it looks like we're getting something new in the system. The war's over, and we got the New Deal wasn't after
the deal
war.
was monopoly capitalism.
Whatever the case, whenever it happened exactly, we'll say 1945 because that ends the war. Quigley starts talking about a pluralistic economy, and he says that the government starts getting more power and going for more power. The government exercises control under pressure from shifting alliances and alignments of the great economic power blocks that surrounded it. So, you can see where this was created from the previous monopoly capitalism, where you have these great economic power blocks. These blocks came to include finance, heavy industry, light industry, commercial and service groups, such as real estate, civil servants, the armed services, labor, farmers, transportation, and others. If any one or several of these blocks became too obviously exploitative of the others form an alignment to pressure the government in the other direction. The chief consequence of such alignments and pressures has been to increase government spending and thus to increase inflation.
Yeah.
In general, let me just finish this paragraph. I think this is relevant. In general, all these pressures have sought to achieve some redistribution of economic resources among the three chief claimants to those resources. These are consumption, capital accumulation, and government services, including defense. In the financial capitalist system before 1929, the great danger had been the great diversion of resources toward capital accumulation to the jeopardy of the two others. In the new pluralistic system that has arisen, the great danger in many countries has been toward increasing consumption to the jeopardy of capital accumulation and public service.
It's an interesting point. I forgot about that part. But so obviously he's talking about the welfare state and the over-reliance, if you want to call it that, of the U.S. economy on consumption, on producing consumer goods versus machinery, etc. But I don't know if that's true, because there's still a lot of investment going on as well.
Well, and then he says in the book that he's not sure if we're entering a new age of expansion or not. because he's too close to the situation, and now he's dead, so we can't ask him. So now we're back to what you and I are discussing all the time is what the heck is going on now. And
Yeah,
I think what I just read leads right into what you were saying about the data capitalism.
Right.
Is that if we have these mega blocks, and these mega blocks are always vying for control, and the way that they deal with one block getting too much control is the other blocks group together and pull the control away from them. If everything is aimed toward consumption, and we know, I mean, just look at today, the way that your cell phone listens to you to advertise what you want, and Facebook is tracking every fucking thing you do in order to sell it to companies and to advertise to you better. Data is a big deal for these power blocks. Massive deal.
Yeah. It is, and it's always been since the inception of financial capitalism. It's been all about data, right? But in the early days of financial capitalism, it was about industry data, specialized data, and now this has morphed into this. We have to collect every possible data point on everything and person and probably creature and plant on the planet. And by collecting all this data, we get reward, because financial capitalism, buying, selling, etc., it rewards those who have all the data.
You want to turn our videos back on?
Yeah. What's also happened now is that no, I lost. Sorry, I was just gonna say what's also
data. We're collecting data, and it used to be you got rewarded for collecting data and doing it accurately, and it helped the system, right? It was good.
Well,
you figured out that this was a good company to invest in. Congratulations, you get money, and it helps. It helps society.
It helps society to reward those who make accurate predictions. But then also what we're seeing now is that not only do you interpret and crunch the data, but you also have entities that are really trying to play God and control the actual data itself, control the human's thoughts, people's actions, people's desires. And so that may just be an outgrowth of financial capitalism, this desire to not only crunch the data, but also be in full-on complete charge of where the data is going.
Exactly. And then, I mean, if just going off of what Quigley says here, is that it overemphasizes consumption to the detriment of everything else. Well, if you can control the thoughts of the consumer from birth, which we know is, I mean, get real, that's what's going on. If you can control the thoughts of the human from birth, you can control the consumption, right? And so now...
That's what really... Yeah.
Go ahead.
That's what, in my opinion, a large reason of why consumer capitalism, or why businesses make consumer goods, why that is even a thing. Obviously, yeah, it satisfies basic needs, demands, etc. But much more importantly, you get people's time and attention, right? You get people to give you feedback on the experiments you're doing with them. Say, oh, do you like this toy car? No. Do you like it in this color? No. Do you like it slightly? Oh, yeah, you like that. So it's like an constant ongoing process of serving the population, finding out about their innermost desires and needs.
While at the same time directing the population. Right?
Well, yeah. I think by having, we saw them trying to take advantage of the attention they have throughout, for example, the rollout of the vaccine injection campaign, where suddenly you had these mega corporations like McDonald's, Krispy Kreme, Bud Light, dangle the carrots of, hey, you can have a free donut if you join this medical gene drug experiment. So all this attention that they've earned through selling these goods that people like, they are putting to use for ulterior motives, ulterior purposes, such as in this case, this medical experiment on the population. but also you gather so much data, much more data than we've ever imagined on these individuals. So it's almost, sometimes it seems like making these goods is just really a sideshow
Right.
almost. And the ongoing long-term project is really collecting more and more data, finding out more and more about humanity, and thus directing and pushing them in a certain direction at some point.
Well, and then, the way you've been talking about this, I wonder, when we look at what Quigley describes as the pluralistic economy, my first thought is that this is the new instrument of expansion, but he emphasizes very clearly, he goes, I don't know. It's too new for me to tell. And I'm wondering, here's the point, is that even though the system looks a little bit different, the game board looks a little bit different, are we still not working with the same industrial capitalism system from, post-Napoleon, where we still do mass production of goods, and we still finance it through pretty much a similar system that we had in the laissez-faire period. Now, the government has taken over more control of the situation, particularly the banking system, and the rules and regulations revolving around that. But the question I'm throwing at you is, are we in a new system, or are we just in another iteration of the one from phase 3?
Well, what characterizes the system is what's the primary method of savings, invention, and investment, right? And so, yeah, we still have agriculture going on too, right? But that doesn't mean we're an agricultural society. Yeah, we still have industrial work going on, but it's not the primary pool or the primary method of savings accumulation. Yeah, we still have stock market, stock financing going on. That still seems to be a pretty relevant way to accumulate profits, and we still have a banking system, etc. But there's a new system that sort of superimposing itself over all of these things, and
that's the
power
track
is moving.
Everything that you do system.
For example, yeah, I mean that's a large part of it.
And then, I mean, let's walk down the aisle of, okay, we did get a new instrument of expansion after World War II, which I think, I mean, if at least if you look in the West, like, I mean, the East got fucked, but if you look at the West, if you look at the boomers that came home, and suddenly you could, use the GI Bill to go to school, get good grades, go to college, get a job, and buy your house, function, and have 12 kids, right? If you participated in the system, you got rewarded after World War II. And I think that applies to the United States. It applies to Canada. It applies to most of Europe. It applies to Australia. I mean, throughout Western civilization, I think that's applicable. Now, I mean, we immediately jump into new wars. I mean, there's Korea, then there's Vietnam, and then there's Iraq 1, and right? I mean, all these wars start happening, but there's overlap as we always talk about, and I think we can't ignore the fact that we entered the nuclear age, right? Where I mentioned before, there's 3 forms of energy, and I scratched my head. I said no, there's 4, because when you talk about chemical energy, talking from my chemical background, is chemical energy. What happens when you reorganize electrons? Nuclear energy happens when you reorganize nuclei, right? When you're either fusing nuclei together or you're splitting them apart, which creates vastly, like, if we think it's exponential from animal to chemical, it's even more exponential from chemical to nuclear, right? So I think, and then he mentioned, I didn't read it, but I didn't read it out loud, but I saw it as I was flipping through the pages, that in 1945, this is why I brought up that date, the government takes control over the money supply. Because before that, they had been allowing the banking, the in quotes, private banking system to do that. And then once they take that over, obviously with help through the Federal Reserve System, now they can control the money supply. And if we've got these power blocks where the way that they operate is by battling each other by leaning on the government, I think we're in a system where the instrument of expansion, again, I'm looking at post-World War II, is a much more government-oriented instrument, right? I mean, again, if we look at the schools, if we go to school, get good grades, go to college, get a job. Schools are government, right? College is government. If you go to the military, that's government. If you go into the civil service, that's government. And if you go to the non-government power blocks, are you interacting, are you doing government work a lot? Right? And is the government directing mostly what you do through regulation? I mean, it's a fucking joke at this point with the environmental regulations, but basically, and zoning, right? Basically, with zoning and environmental regulations, you can control what's happening down to the square foot in every area. We're not zoned for that. You can't do it. Oh no, there's a puddle of water there. It's a wetland. You can't build it there, unless you have enough money to say, okay, well, you'll plant some trees on the other side of the state, so we'll allow you to do it here, but because you're Amazon, but we wouldn't allow that guy to do it over there because he's Jim.
Well,
right.
I have. Yeah, sorry.
No. Go for it.
I have a bit of a problem because with this whole description,
the pluralistic description,
the pluralistic.
Yeah. Okay. Let's walk down the other aisle. Okay. Let's say it's not that. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say that it is probably what he's saying there, but the process he's describing there seems so commonplace to me. It's like that's always been the case. There's always been different lobbying groups trying to get influence within the government.
I think the difference here is the government got so much power through the New Deal, and that the mega blocks, they are the most recent iterations of the monopoly capitalism, where they're big enough to finance their own factories and infrastructure and shit. That okay, the government just gave itself this massive amount of power, and also it just woke up the next day. We're talking about America here. It woke up the next day, and it's the most powerful government on the face of the planet, right? Both externally and now internally too, because it equipped itself with all these new regulations, and you got these mega blocks of industry that now have all this power. If you go back 100 years, even though there was lobbying, they didn't have the power that they did now.
Could be, yeah. I mean, these mega blocks of not just industry, we have sovereign wealth funds, we have hedge funds with lots of money, we have private individuals, billionaires, NGOs. It would actually be interesting to see how much do each of these groups control in terms of
So I think
capital ownership, money.
If I'm going to try to describe it simply, if we now have basically government direction being the instrument of expansion after World War II, right after World War II, if you participated in it, you benefited. Again, the go to school, get good grades, go to college, get a job, get married, buy the house, boom, you benefit. Now, if you go to school. It doesn't matter what grades you get. Go to college. Again, doesn't matter what grades you get. Not only did you not get anything useful, you've now acquired a life-crippling debt that there's a good chance you could never pay yourself out of, and you've gained a life-crippling mind virus that I guess is easier to get out of because there's so much stuff to listen to like this to help people get out of it. But I mean, they get into it, and just look at the insanity going around. Just look at the number of masks that are still kicking around. Right. Is whatever the internal function, the details of the internal function were after 1945. Again, this is not looking at it moralistically. Is that it functioned. And the direction of the government gave back to the citizenry. Now, the direction of the government leeches from the citizenry, because what do we see? We see, okay, let's ship everything off to China and India and destroy all the manufacturing here. Okay, check, we got that part done. All right, and then we've had Dr. E. Michael Jones on here, and I've been reading through his book, Barren Metal. The conflict between labor and usury. It's basically a Catholic perspective on everything that we've been talking about so far in this show. It's very fascinating. I'm about halfway through it. And he brings up, God, I went off on a sidetrack and I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
Well, we're talking about barren metal and usury.
Right before that.
And,
You lost your train of thought too? Shit. Okay, so we were talking about the government functioning, right? Okay, leverage buyouts. That's what I wanted to get into. So Dr. Jones points this out that I believe in the 80s, people figure out how to do, or not that they figure out how to do it, Andrew Carnegie figured out how to do this, but how to really exploit this, which is to say you utilize the financial system to buy a company, you crank up the debt. So let's say, it's $100 million to buy this company, and then you get a $200 million loan. That's probably more than, okay, let's say it's a $130 million loan, right? So you get this extra $30 million, and let's say that the business's cash flow can handle $100 million of debt, but it can't handle $130 million of debt. Nima and I facilitate this acquisition. We take the $30 million, we stick it in our pocket, and we go, ha, fuck you, business, and we walk away. And then the business can no longer handle the debt service, and it slowly collapses and dies. And the thing that the business did is no longer happening, and everybody employed there is all laid off, or all laid off. But you and I, Nima, we made off with $30 million, $15 million each, and so we can go plunder.
How did we? But that's an incredibly simplistic observation of this whole LBO process, in my opinion. Because how did we pocket all this? How do we make all this money? Generally speaking, you have to improve the business that you acquire, and then you sell it off and allow it to continue. Then are there inefficiencies in some businesses? Do some people get laid off sometimes? Yeah, that happens. Is it being done exploitatively in some cases? Yes, maybe, but I don't really understand the systematic argument here, or what this.
I'll have to reread that chapter and see what Dr. Jones says.
Yeah.
And to your point, I mean, I just did this, as you know, in a much smaller scale. And I mean, just to give an example of numbers, so I just did a $750,000 acquisition, and I was able to get a $160,000 in working capital. And not that I'm going to fucking do this, so nobody save this clip and play it back at me. But I mean, theoretically, what if I just took that 160 grand, stuck it in my pocket, and said, "Bye, everybody"? I totally wouldn't be worth 160 grand.
You'd be in trouble with all kinds of people that you've made commitments to. They would be coming after you for that money.
But what if I did it in a way where I said, okay, well, the company's still making money. It still has enough money to function. You guys keep working. You keep making money at it. However, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of whether or not I'm straddling the line with that debt. I'm not. But let's say it was straddling the line. You say, okay, well, here's the management. Here's I paid myself my bonus, and here's the management that's going to take care of it and keep the business running. But we do it at the level where it just can't quite make it. And okay, we got to lay some people off because now there's just too much debt. Now that we laid some people off, then we don't have the people to do the work, so we're not bringing that much revenue, and it just kind of slowly peters out and dies. And then if I got a really good lawyer, well, should I, was I being exploitative when I paid that when I paid myself that bonus or not? Oh, the business looks like it was functioning to me, right? Mm-hmm. So, I'm not saying that this is the end all of what's destroying the financial system, but I think it's worth pointing out that that is a possibility. And if we look at instruments versus institutions, the way I used it was an instrument, right? I utilized the leveraged buyout in order to acquire the business, and I'm going to run it well. I'm not going to pull it out and just let it die, right? That still functions and that still works, but there is the potential to do it the way that I just described. And there is, as far as I'm able to tell, the incentive to do that. And I think it's just a perfect example of how the system can start to, act against its original purpose. The original purpose of the financial system being, okay, let's find useful and productive businesses or useful and productive things to do and finance them to make that happen, as opposed to let's find productive things that are already happening and suck them dry.
Right. Which this suck 'em dry thing, I don't really necessarily, I don't know if that's a systemic feature of this late stage financial capitalism. But what we definitely see, what I find much more important, is that we see the manipulation of people's thoughts, which then in turn lead to the manipulation of future people's actions, and also just the manipulation of events. You're just inventing a pandemic out of thin air.
Inventing an insurrection out of thin air.
Inventing an insurrection, inventing so much nonsense and bullshit that in turn, as we know from George Soros' reflexivity, blah, 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 those thoughts and beliefs in and of themselves start then precipitating actual real life events, and they manifest in reality, not just in people's minds. But definitely, I find that to be far more egregious and far more striking and overarching in terms of, if I had to describe today's capitalistic system, I think it really rests on this giant media apparatus creating stories that people act on, and the way they act creates opportunity.
Let's make that specific with the media apparatus and COVID, and of all the things that could be going on with COVID, let's just focus on this one thing. Let's just focus on the Pfizer shot, right? Mm-hmm. How many shots does Pfizer get to sell because it's coordinating with governments and media on this marketing campaign? Right? And I mean, the Pfizer CEO goes to the World Economic Forum talking about if we was he talking about microchipping the vaccines? I don't remember, but something about microchipping the medicine to confirm that people took it.
So we're gonna have a pill that once you ingest it, people we can tell whether they took it or not. Imagine the compliance.
Imagine the compliance. So is the instrument that he is supposed to represent, let's say, I'm in the health system, I'm supposed to be supplying goods and services to help people get healthy, versus I'm going to use the government apparatus to force people to take this experimental drug and I get paid for it. Yeah, there he is. Imagine the compliance.
Wi-Fi microchip pills. I mean, it's like, once again, going back to my point, these are cartoonishly ridiculous outgrowths of data capitalism, I think. You say you can use data capitalism for good, but you can also use it for completely cartoonishly evil, villain, psychotic purposes.
Like mustache twirling.
Right.
Yes.
And I mean, if this is not what that is, then I don't know what is.
Well, he's got the twirl with the fingers. He's just missing the mustache. So, but I mean, combining the points that we were bringing up, these are both examples of the institutionalization of what we're trying to figure out what's going on, right?
So I guess, just to be clear, we're trying to figure out how do we characterize today's system of capitalism, right?
Right.
I don't know if we make that clear.
Yeah, and then I don't know how successful we're being, but I think that the conversation is important because
yes.
The next part of the conversation, regardless of what exactly the instrument of expansion, how exactly it's working and how exactly it's institutionalizing, I think, that just like the leverage buyout thing, I'm just trying to give an example of how things could be crystallizing today. And I think, like you also mentioned, the control of the media, allowing us just to create stories and say, okay, here's this pandemic, buy this vaccine. And you didn't even have to buy it. It's free everywhere. We made the government buy it. I mean, it's beyond asinine. What's that?
Right. The distinctive factor if we compare today's system to all the older systems, in my opinion, is the abundance of data about everything and everyone. Because as far as we're aware, that's never been possible, right? So I think if we want to, and I don't think Quigley did this at the time because we weren't there yet, but
right.
If we want to characterize today's new instrument of expansion, it would have to somehow involve data and data crunching, data manipulation, because that seems to be so much more relevant today than it was back in even the early days.
It's so valuable. I mean, if we look at the mega corporations now, and corporations not even the word I want to use. The mega economic players. Now it's Facebook, it's Amazon, it's Microsoft, it's what's another mega one?
It's also, by the way, it's also DARPA and Gavi and the WHO and NGOs in general.
Well, and then, I guess the financial system is still there. And what does the financial system depend on? Credit. Right, which is your data. And here's a side note for you and for everybody else, is that the three main credit systems that deal with individual credit, not business credit or anything like that, they get paid when you give them information, and they get paid when you request information from them. So it's a very strange incentive, but they just have so much money coming in from every angle because the data is so valuable. to your point, right?
So the data is becoming the commodity in and of itself, and rather than just an instrument to make more money and accumulate more surpluses. The data by itself is almost like it's becoming the energy or the currency or the commodity of today's age.
Now that I'm thinking about that, so just like with the data we can create the consumer, with the data we can shut out who we don't like, right? So I mean, let's instrument and institutionalize the data, right? With the instrument of the data, I could check your credit report and say, oh, well, man, you got like 3 bankruptcies. I'm not lending you anything, right? Or hey, you have great payment history. Let me throw let me give you this loan as fast as I can. Boom. Yep. Now it's, oh, hey, you said something that we're construing as racist. You no longer get to have a voice on YouTube, which is the main communications platform.
Right.
In the world today, right? So, Nima and I have discussed this multiple times, and this is why we wanted to talk about this on a show, is that the response, the circumventing that we're seeing of this institution is decentralization.
Yeah.
Which, of course, the internet is kind of the fundamental point of that, is which the internet is also allowing all this data sharing to fly around everywhere. But I mean, okay, let's say we've got all this data sharing, and you've been determined to be a racist, so we're canceling your bank account. Now, typically, that should kill you. That should end you in your tracks. You're done. However, we now have a new system coming along, which is something called cryptocurrency, right? So now, we're not here to say that cryptocurrency is going to save the world or be the next Jesus or whatever, but you can't deny that there's a lot of people in institutions who should have been canceled out of society who are continuing to function because they have access to the crypto world. Gab is a perfect example of it, right?
WikiLeaks. Yeah.
WikiLeaks. Same thing, like our show. We're kicked off of motherfucking YouTube, right? But I was actually itching myself. This wasn't a fuck you, but it was a perfect timing for one, YouTube, right? We've got Rumble, we got BitChute, we got Buzzsprout, we got Odyssey, we got blah, 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 all these different things where we could still get the voice out because they're decentralized. So there's this decentralization revolution, and I mean, I would include stuff like this in file sharing, torrents. I would, and yes. I mean, to that example, supposedly Hunter Biden's online account or something was hacked, and people are able to get into like his search records and shit. And Poll, all this stuff is getting spread around on 4chan. I saw them encouraging each other to share it on torrents.
Yes, they did, actually. They did.
So
it's already on the torrents. Yeah, it's already unstoppable.
So, I mean, what a perfect example of, okay, we're using the data in order to shut people down, but we can't shut them down because the shit's decentralized. Well, what about 3D printing? If we can torrent 3D printing guns and you have a 3D printer and then you can just print your own guns. I know 3D printing is not good enough to just build your entire own gun out of 3D printing stuff. But the point being is that, okay, it used to be you had to make a factory and the factory made all the stuff. Well, now you can have 3D printers. And again, I understand that the technology isn't there yet with those that they can make anything. But imagine if you had a 3D printer at home. It's basically a replicator from Star Trek that can make whatever the hell you wanted. How does that change the monopoly capitalists' ability to constrict goods? Right?
It makes it much harder.
So, yeah. And then
it is definitely a challenge to a centralized system.
Well, and then talk about education. So right now, I mean, we talked about before. After 1945, you go to school, you get good grades, get a job, boom, you're doing fine. That's no longer the case. Well, what system, if you participate in it, do you actually get rewarded? Well, if you find there's education online all over the place. I closed on this business. I've done real estate deals from education that I learned online. I didn't learn it in fucking school, right? So there's this decentralized network that's outside of the traditional educational system that says, look, we will teach you how to actually function and succeed in the world as it exists now. And you can plug into that because things are decentralized, right? So I think what we're seeing, again, regardless of the specific details of what the actual description of what the institution is right now and what the instrument was supposedly after 1945, we're seeing a massive institutionalization, like Nima has pointed out, on data. And, here's another example on the institutionalization of data is retirement plans, right? So, you used to be rewarded in the world of data if we say, okay, we're trying to figure out what stocks to buy and what stocks to sell. Well, and what stocks to allocate money to, what businesses to allocate money to. Well, if you pick the right business and that business does well, you get rewarded. Now, because of retirement plans, everybody's money gets shoved into retirement plans, and because they don't know it or they don't want to deal with it, they don't realize that for a lot of the time you can self-direct those retirement plans and buy something else with them. They get shoved into the stock market. So all this massive amount of money gets shoved into the stock market, and that has nothing to do with, is this a good business? Does it have good management? Do they have good prospects? It's none of that. It's just crazy money sloshing around, right? And so now being rewarded with data, it isn't to do with, okay, is the business any good? It's how keyed in am I to how the markets are being manipulated?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I mean, we all know that they're fucking manipulated. So I guess the closer you are to that source, the better your data, and the closer you are to, and the closer you are to knowing how the people are going to be manipulated through the data. Like if we were with Pfizer, the CEO, knowing that COVID was around the corner and we got our vaccines ready, we know the government's going to buy it. Like, we've got control with all this data and we can manipulate the market to buy all of our millions of dollars in vaccines. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, the market's manipulated. It's not just the market's manipulated. It's like reality is manipulated, right? You forget about the markets and financial games, whatever. What I find much more foundational is just the fact that people's reality is being manipulated. And then with that reality, obviously outcomes are manipulated. And by the way, Moderna was a DARPA project. I just heard that today. I can believe it. I think in 2013.
Imagine my shock.
I was looking just throughout this whole vaccine rollout off and on. I looked into Moderna and I found it interesting that this is not really a company that has ever brought a product to market before the COVID shots. Well, why are we suddenly being told this is the company that is selling you the things that will protect you from
From the
doom
boogeyman
and
virus, yes.
yeah, selling you this amazing stuff that's absolutely safe and effective, no doubt. Why is it a company that's completely that's a new kid on the block, basically? It's been around for years, but apparently Moderna did a project with DARPA. So they've been running on a DARPA deal, and the DARPA deal was about introducing mRNA to fight diseases such as cancer, etc., whatever lofty goals they have down the road. But in order to do that, obviously they need some experimentation with the people.
That actually goes back to what I think that corroborates my analysis of what I thought is the instrument and institution of expansion post World War II, which is government direction, right? Big power blocks working with government direction to what's that? Produce excess, save excess, and reinvest that excess, right? And again, this isn't looking at this morally. I'm not saying I like this situation, but post 1945, you could participate in that system as an individual and be rewarded. Now you're punished for it.
And it's so interesting that the way the COVID compliance has been enforced globally, it's been like a military drill, right? It's not been really a business a product that's for sale. It's not really been a debate or a conversation with the population. It was done with the forcefulness of a military campaign. And this makes sense in light of the fact that the military was behind all of this. Mm-hmm. And so there's no compromising with a military campaign. There's no arguing, right?
Right.
There's only, here's what has to be done. And I think it's just pretty clear that it goes hand in hand with that historical observation that Moderna was basically a creation of DARPA. It says here, DARPA was instrumental in the development of RNA vaccines and provided $25 million in financial support to Moderna in 2019 to pursue messenger RNA-based antibody drugs and vaccines. DARPA announced it was committing up to $56 million in additional funding to Moderna this October, which is, I believe, 2020. But yeah, so how do you succeed in this world? Like, I actually think when I first entered the marketplace and started a business, etc., I just wanted to make products and services that people are willing to pay for, and then if I do well, I succeed. But if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody like that in today's world, just how realistic is that even anymore? It really does seem like today you have to go through, or most people will just.
I think it's still realistic.
They have to go through.
I think it's still realistic that system is there and it still works. It's just that nobody shows you how to use it.
Right.
There's no training. I mean, you find it online, like I just described out before. There's people who talk about it online, but if you follow the traditional avenues of what you're supposed to do in order to get educated, there's no training on it. There's nothing.
True. So obviously, we have cryptocurrency, we have these things, but if I were to go through, it's like 20 years ago, if I went through established venues, I still had some sort of opportunity to be individualistic and come out with innovative products. But in today's world, it just seems like everything is so predetermined, everything is so assembly line style, shoved in your face. Here's the social media that you're going to be using, Facebook and Twitter. And here's the colleges that you're going to be going to. And here's where you can get a loan or not. And here's the things that you're allowed to say. Here's the kind of person you're allowed to be if you ever even want to think about having a career. It just seems like the system has become more top-down streamlined. And as you said, at the same time, that in and of itself has brought about a lot of opportunity in all the circumvention efforts that are around. Like you said, people aren't told about them. I mean, they're not shilled for by a gazillion and the trillions of dollars of money. The White House doesn't pay influencers.
Yeah, right. The White House isn't paying us.
The White House doesn't bribe influencers to tell people about ways in which they can become better persons, more successful persons, understand the monetary system, understand the media propaganda, understand how minds are manipulated. No,
understand how to be self-sufficient, understand how to make money, nothing.
Yeah, no, but they pay people to show for some corporate pharma experiment. That's what's really important in this day and age to these players. So
I think it's worth bringing up. I'm going to slightly change here. So did you have a point you wanted to finish? You're smirking.
Well, just that all the incentives and disincentives are so obvious now, right? The things you're allowed and supposed to do in today's world are very limited, and the venues to success without getting in debt, without risking it all, and all these things, they're very limited in this day and age.
Yeah,
so I think that's where a lot of people are frustrated. But then, as you said, there's no need to be frustrated, because that in and of itself brings about opportunities. Because if you have a whole bunch of people being incoherent, unable to think anymore, unable to think critically, unable to come up with new ideas, just parroting talking points, the latest UN and whatever foundations talking points, that means that there's tons and tons of opportunity if you just step out of line a little bit. If you just explore alternatives a little bit.
And I mean, what we're describing just sounds like completely analogous to what we described with the other iterations of Western civilization, which is that, okay, here comes Henry the Fourth or Henry the Fifth or whatever it was, and he's going to come conquer, and then he won the Battle of War of Swords, but we invented a new thing, and that doesn't even matter anymore. So go have fun with that. And then Napoleon goes to win the War of Muskets, and he's like, I got it. And then England's like, yeah, well, we don't really care. You can have that because we invented this new system. Well, I mean, are we not seeing the same thing where it's not like the new system comes along and the old system goes, okay, you're the new system, I'll just go away now. It fights to the fucking death. Right?
Exactly. It's like it's convulsions of a dying system, and it really is that, because there's no genuine grassroots support behind this kind of system. There's no passionate people behind it. There's just platitudes and talking points, and those who benefit from the system trying to maintain whatever's left of it, trying to maintain some semblance of a system that they still have control over.
Yes. And then I wanted to add this because we didn't mention it. We did not mention this at the beginning. So when we talked about how an instrument becomes an institution, by essentially a vested interest gets developed inside of that instrument, which aims to serve itself as opposed to serve whatever goal that the societal organization was supposed to have. First off, I don't think we emphasize this, is that this applies to any human institution. I don't care if it's your local church group or your government. It's any, right? But second, Quigley points this out, and I totally agree with this. This is not a deterministic process. I believe it appears to be deterministic because we're not aware of it. But once we become aware of it, now we can make decisions and say, wait a minute, we're doing this, and this is going to lead to that. So let's do something else in order to avoid it. Right? Or I guess in this case, if the system is so gunked up that we can't do anything about it, which I think we can talk about that too. So gunked up that we can't do anything about it, it was like, well, here's how we can circumvent the old system by participating in this new one. Now, I think it's also worth pointing out that, there's circumventing and there's reform, right? Reform means you go in and you fix the old system and change it. Circumventing is you leave the old system as it is and you just make a new one that replaces it. Circumvention is way easier than reform typically, but I think there is a place to speak for reform. I mean, if we look at the government, right? The government system as complex as it is. I don't think that we're going to just simply circumvent the government system like that. And if we do, I don't necessarily think we're going to come up with something better. And again, I'm speaking specifically about the United States system here. We got a pretty good system the way that it was designed. It's not being used very well, but we got a pretty good system. And if you mentioned George Soros and the theory of reflexivity, if we approach that system saying, oh my God, it's totally corrupt and it's filled with corrupt people, I want nothing to do with it, well, that's what we're going to get. If we approach the system of like, okay, I can go in there and change it, and then, hey, if you understand this conversation, and you can walk in there and say, okay, now that I'm a member of this organization, what is the purpose of this organization, and how do I keep it moving along to that purpose? Or maybe we don't need it to be that purpose anymore because that doesn't make sense anymore. Maybe it should be this purpose over here. But whatever it is, we're paying attention to the purpose as opposed to serving whatever vested interest is associated with it. I thought Nima was going to have something right after that.
Well, what is this new system? It's decentralization, like we've really never seen before, which obviously goes hand in hand with the information revolution, but it's very different from the data capitalism, or at least the outgrowth of data capitalism that we've seen today, because cryptocurrency doesn't need any of this stuff. Cryptocurrency doesn't need to know what your preferences are, where you're going every Monday, what your job is, what your habits are. All these things are irrelevant. And I mean, they're irrelevant to the functioning of the cryptocurrency system. Mm-hmm. So the cryptocurrency system takes everything back to the individual. And much like everything else that's part of the decentralization revolution, takes everything back to the individual, such as 3D printing, homeschooling, permaculture, gardening, farming in general. Did I say 3D printing? I think
you did say 3D printing. Torrents, file sharing.
Exactly.
Decentralized video networks. Yes.
Yeah, the internet hopefully one day will be a decentralized internet, which will all be part of this circumvention of the old system that we're seeing right now. In other words, we're kind of seeing the old, the ancient regime trying to grab a hold of a new system that really is not susceptible to the kind of takeover that they're used to. And that's why, they need to pour so much efforts into controlling everyone, controlling the data, controlling the outcomes, controlling the thoughts, controlling the individual. And that in and of itself is just very burdensome, very annoying. It has to be a very annoying task to try to keep this facade up while everyone can have these conversations now. There's decentralized systems. We can all tell each other, here's the vaccine deaths, here's the vaccine injuries. It's right here in the government report. Look, it's right here. Yeah, you can deny it because
you can censor us on YouTube. You can kick us off of Facebook, but we're still getting the message out.
We'll be on 5 other platforms. We'll have it on torrents. And, just now, as we just said, Hunter Biden's phone has been hacked now, a whole bunch of that. And they're really just going to try to pretend like there's nothing going on while everyone sees what's going on. Well, how long can that be sustained?
I hope shorter rather than longer. And speaking of shorter rather than longer, Nima, we're almost at 2 hours.
Yeah, it was a long one.
It was a good one. It took us a while to get to our point, but I think that lead up was necessary because otherwise nobody has any idea what we're talking about. Cool. Well, this has been Dylan Moore and Nima Mahdjour of IridaTV. We've been doing it live, and follow us at IridaTV. Follow us on Gab. Follow us on BitChute. Follow us on Rumble, but do not look for us on YouTube. We've been banned. Follow us on Telegram, too. Telegram seems to be our favorite place to go. So, IridaTV, Dylan Moore, Nima Mahdjour, doing it live. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.